In a media landscape dominated by remakes, legacy sequels, and reboots, a film like Tim Burton's Beetlejuice Beetlejuice is thoroughly unremarkable, and there have been so many films like it. A mediocre, muddled legacy sequel to a beloved 80s film is far from an unusual sight to the 2020s moviegoer. However, with that said, I am not so quick to write this film off completely, as I think when viewed in the context of the wider career of Tim Burton, Beetlejuice 2 marks a fascinating moment in the director's history. It contains within it the lingering spirit of Burton's style, a ghost of a creative style that had long been assumed to be buried. Stopping myself before I can expand on what exactly I mean, first we regrettably have to take a little history lesson. Timothy Walter Burton was born in. Okay, no, I'm kidding, we don't have to go back that far. A former Disney animator, Burton emerged as a director in the mid to late 80s with his initial feature films opening to massive success. Beginning in 1985 with Pee Wee's Big Adventure, Burton would go on to cement what would become universally known as his signature style with his second film, 1988's Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice is a very singular film in many respects, a dark and absurd comedy about gentrification that borrows heavily from the goth subculture and makes extensive use of blue screens, stop motion, a German expressionist influenced set design, and some of the most impressive prosthetic makeup this side of the Elephant Man. With Beetlejuice, we see the establishment of Burton's mean spirited sense of humour, from the Maitland's car being held up from the water by a dog on a plank, down to the morbid eccentricities of Burton's afterlife. Beetlejuice was a home run, critically and financially, and off of the back of its success, Burton and Michael Keaton would reunite to create 1989's Batman, which, while easy to forget now, was the first live action interpretation of the character since the campy days of Adam West, and marked a fundamental shift in how the character was perceived in the wider cultural conscience. Colourful villains in bright costumes replaced by a dark, brooding, gothic atmosphere. Off of these mammoth successes, Burton's style quickly became a recognizable symbol evoking counterculture, goth aesthetics, and morbid humor, with Tim Burton even becoming enough of a household name to have his signature put on The Nightmare Before Christmas, despite not being that film's director. These early years of Burton's career are hit after hit, from the quirkiness of Edward Scissorhands, to the macabre sexuality of Batman Returns, to the genuinely heartfelt and empathetic Ed Wood. And at the time it must have seemed as if the director's streak would never end, that the well would never run dry. But then something changed. There's disagreement over which film truly marks the beginning of Burton's decline. Some say Mars Attacks, some say Sleepy Hollow. I personally would put it as late as 2001's Planet of the Apes, but regardless of the specifics, there is no doubt that around the turn of the millennium, there was a shift in Burton's output. Put simply, the scrappy anti-establishment director who'd been fired from Disney for producing something as dark as Frankenweenie had come full circle. As his success had grown, his name had become a brand, and brands are managed, restrained. The anti-establishmentarian had become the establishment. We see this most directly in Burton's presence in the remake scene, producing in 20 years remakes and reboots for Planet of the Apes, Dark Shadows, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Alice in Wonderland, Dumbo, and even a feature-length version of the very short film that had so long ago gotten him fired from Disney, Frankenweenie. None of these films felt of akin with Burton's previous works. They almost felt like parody, a visual style that had been taken and twisted through layers of computer-generated imagery, but that lacked the heart, the spite, and the bile of Burton's early years. The mean-spirited humour was whittled away, and by the time of 2010's Alice in Wonderland had become a shadow on the wall of a cave, leaving us with what felt like pastiches of his former works. The last film that truly felt of a piece with Burton's best was 2007's Sweeney Todd, which went beyond merely adapting a staged musical into the realm of actually applying a directorial vision and adapting the material to support it. But for over a decade after Sweeney Todd, it seemed as if that had been the dying gasp of the real Tim Burton, the death knell for a career defined by being strange and unusual, to continue in the shambling cadaver of an establishment shooter. And so it was that after 2 decades of this decline period, that Beetlejuice 2, titled Beetlejuice Beetlejuice, entered active production. As someone for whom the original Beetlejuice ranks among my favourite films of all time, this news was exhausting to receive. Years into the modern trend of remakes and legacy sequels, the concept of this decline period Tim Burton going back and fiddling with the films of his golden age was not something I eagerly anticipated, and since it had been over 15 years since his last good film, was in fact something that induced a sense of dread in me. Even the casting of Jenna Ortega, despite her being one of my favourite of Hollywood's young stars, felt empty and calculated, hot off the heels of her collaboration with Burton on Netflix's Wednesday, feeling like a further attempt at bolstering Burton's brand with new talent, in the wake of many of his frequent collaborators, well, let's just say no longer being available. But then it was, in September of 2024, that I walked into my local cinema and sat down to watch Beetlejuice Beetlejuice, and I was left struggling to vocalise my thoughts. The film itself was as overstuffed and unfocused as a legacy sequel is wont to be, but there remained this unfamiliar feeling, as if there was something under the surface here struggling to be heard above the noise. This is what I mean by the lingering spirit of Tim Burton. Beetlejuice 2 does not simply feel like a classic Burton film because of the presence of many of his collaborators, Catherine O'Hara, Michael Keaton, Danny Elfman, etc., but because of the ways in which they are used. Take, for example, Jeffrey Jones, who played Charles Dietz in the original Beetlejuice and also worked with Burton on Ed Wood and Sleepy Hollow. Jones does not feature in Beetlejuice 2, presumably because of his 2002 conviction for possession of child sex abuse materials. Instead of his absence being hand-waved away, like for example the absence of Gina Davis and Alec Baldwin, his character is turned into an extremely mean-spirited running gag, where one of the film's opening scenes depict a claymation sequence of him surviving a plane crash and being eaten by a shark, and his decapitated corpse is later depicted wandering the afterlife aimlessly, spurting blood everywhere. This choice is something distinctly Burton, morbid and mean but genuinely funny. The set design of The Afterlife 2 feels as focused and careful as anything Burton's done in years, with genuine attempts made to adhere to the original film's twisted absurdity, joined with the mundanity of the afterlife's bureaucracy, in a way that feels cohesive and thought out. Another way in which Beetlejuice 2 feels like a genuine relation to its predecessor is in its themes. Beetlejuice was an absurd, morbid take on gentrification, with Delia and Charles representing the worst of yuppie culture coming to a nice small town and robbing it of its personality and charm. Delia obsessed with her terrible sculptures, and Charles constantly looking for ways to make money. Otho being the kind of person to overstate their experience in everything as a way to seem authoritative and intelligent. Beetlejuice 2 shares this cynical take on modern middle-class trends, but not in real estate habits, since no one can buy a house anymore, but in the modern iteration of hustle culture. Jane, the real estate agent's husband, has a microbrewery. Delia's horrid sculptures have given way to her hosting an art show, spending much of this film obsessed with trying to capture true grief, which is just a performance. Much of this film is preoccupied with the concept of grief as a manipulative performance. Delia, of course, is trying to capture her moment of grief for her art show, but we also see Lydia's fiancé Rory try to use the grief of her father's funeral to leverage his way into a proposal, claiming to have written a poem for her father, even claiming his grandfather died recently, when recently turns out to mean decades ago, as well as Astrid's sinister love interest, Jeremy, who uses her mourning of her father as a way to trick her into taking his place in the afterlife. This idea similarly lends itself to the absurdity and arbitrary nature of death in the film, from Charles's funeral having a choir of children singing Harry Belafonte's Banana Boat song, and a priest who speaks exclusively in nonsensical word salad, to Delia's ultimate death at the fangs of asps she bought online in pursuit of embracing her grief. The film doesn't reject mourning. Clearly, we see this as Astrid continues to mourn her father years after his untimely demise, but instead it criticizes and mocks the nature of modern grief, which is particularly resonant today in a world where all grief is expected to be posted. Beetlejuice 2 has this preoccupation with grief in a way that feels so intrinsically Burton, taking a sardonic, irreverent swipe at a modern trend that is rarely discussed. Another way in which Beetlejuice 2 feels like a film made by a Tim Burton who cares is in the way Lydia Deetz is portrayed in the film. Lydia in the original film is a character who reflects how the world once saw Tim Burton. She is young and willful. She dresses goth in all black. She has a deep sorrow and resistance to connection. She is strange and unusual. In this way, it makes perfect sense that the sequel takes that connection and strengthens it, with Lydia now having sold out, hosting a television show where she leverages her strangeness, her abilities, her connection to the macabre, to make profit by churning out the same content episode after episode. It's hard with everything we've discussed not to see the parallel to a strange and unusual director who entered the studio system only to have his abilities, his strangeness, leveraged to make profit by churning out the same visual style movie after movie, not truly putting his soul into any of it. Lydia and Burton both became brands without realizing, and I think it's telling that in the end, Lydia is able to put an end to her show and spend time with her daughter, but she still remains haunted by the spectre of Beetlejuice. All of these things lurk beneath the surface of Beetlejuice 2, and they genuinely feel to me like the long-lost spark of a once great director finally waking up again. To be clear, I am not saying this means we're going to get a Tim Burton renaissance. What I am saying is that it seems as if making this film, whether because of the connection to his origins or for any number of other reasons, inspired a creative instinct in Burton that I, and many others, had long thought to be dead and buried, a clerk in the netherworld. None of these factors make Beetlejuice 2 a good or great movie. It is, as I said, mediocre and muddled. But I wanted to make this video to talk about this one specific aspect, to chart the strange career of one of Hollywood's most famous directors. If Sweeney Todd represented the dying gasp of the Burton style, I think Beetlejuice 2 shows that its ghost lingers, and maybe that it's not ready to move on just yet. Thank you for watching. If you liked, please like and subscribe. Bada yada yada. Good night.